the more experimental people join.
All these hobbies.
Tom Gotti, I'm in the graduate urban planning and environmental planning program.
I'm Aisha Youngish. I'm in the graduate center for planning and the environment. I was trying to say the same.
My name is Westridge. I'm a professor of history and the author of social science. I'm teaching a new course in prehistory, which I hope to develop and be my own course. I believe history totally, teaching just prehistory.
I'm John Sanko, I'm teaching.
Doug Robbins, I teach in the social science department. My primary field psychology.
Bill Mankin, I'm the rest of the planning department. Tom and Ashley.
Amy Snyder, art and design education.
Bill Castellano, chairman of the foundation department.
Jack Nichols, history and economics.
Stephen Klein, I teach in graduate interior design.
Do you want to? We're just giving our names and serial numbers. Yeah.
A lot of bread. Pat Jolkowski, English department.
Well, I have this huge thing here in front of me, but I'm not going to read it. I'm planning, unless something changes, which is fine, I mean, coming from your direction, but I'm planning today to talk a little bit about Derrida and feminist film theory for a variety of reasons, and I'll tell you in a minute. But next time I will do, if you like, something more classically considered, Birmingham cultural studies. I'm going to do the place of television in cultural studies, from Stuart Hall to Frederick Jameson to a very wonderful, wonderful young theorist who I like very much, Richard Deinst, who has a book out called Still Life in Real Time. And so I'll go through some of that and questions of democracy and questions of public discourse. Richard Deinst. I-E-N-S-T. T, yes. He's in Indiana, at Indiana. Yes, it's Duke. He's a student of Fred's, Frederick Jameson's. It's quite a little Oedipal thing there. And then the time after that, if we're really there, and then, and beyond, because, by that time I'll feel attached, and then I'll just keep on coming here for lunch. So I hope to do some stuff about bodies, Judith Butler and Liz Gross, some feminist stuff on bodies and technology. And this is a strange sort of book I'm working on, and I am going to draw from my own book, and that's why you're getting what I just said, because I was asked by University of Minnesota Press to do a book on post-structuralism because I'm one of those people who really likes post-structuralism and always have. And I said I would, and then I, didn't. It was supposed to be one of those little books, everything you wanted to know, and I'm really not good at that kind of stuff, and so I started to write it, and the book went boom someplace else, because I've been wanting to write a book on television for a long time. And so the editors said, this is good, go with it, forget the other thing. But meanwhile, the book has a little taste of reviewing things, so I thought it would help to use it here, because it does review some things. Forgive me, I don't know what you need reviewed and what you don't, but it's reviewed with a purpose of going in another direction. Let me tell you which two. One is post-structuralism, but I won't drive you nuts with talking about it, because I know some people are allergic to it, and they don't have to be. But I do think post-structuralism and most of the sillier critiques about it work on its impact on epistemology, epistemological questions of knowing. And I really think that if you include a good dose of the new Derrida, for instance, and all of Deleuze, for instance, you really get a nice picture that it's about ontology. And I suspect, I don't know what that word means either. I mean, in the introduction I make clear I'm not doing but I think there are ways of reading that work to see the interest in all of those people in television, in cybernetics, in the text, if you know how to look for them, and an attempt to rethink the relationship between human beings and machines. That's what I take television to be, on one hand, a figure for rethinking technology. And so I'm not really able to be totally original about that. I wish I were. So I'm trying to be original about reading some old, monumentally big pieces that caused trouble called cultural studies and made people foam at the mouth and want to hurt other people and stuff like that. And to read them differently and to see what might have been missed in all the commotion of making them into this says there's no reality, this says there's no way of knowing anything, this says everything's relative. Well, I don't think any of the people in post-structuralism ever were saying anything quite like that, although I don't want to deny some of those readings, came from somewhere, Now, auto-affection is a term that Derrida uses. I think it's Husserl. I mean, at least I see it always when he's talking to and about Husserl, because you'll see in a minute, but so it may actually, I'm not sure whose term it is, but he uses it, you'll see it on page 2 of the piece I gave you, but it means the hearing yourself speak inside your head, sort of, or wherever you do that, or the closed circuit between mouth and ear. And it has been in Western philosophy, according to Derrida, the way that people came to think of, or the image or the figure, talking about how people thought there was something inner, an inner presence, that one speaks, that one expresses, that one speaks one's own voice, one speaks in one's own voice, all that stuff, which you may or may not know Derrida intends to critique at all times, to deconstruct or unsettle in at least 2 directions. One has always been connected with Marxism, because the deconstruction goes always in a direction. It's an activity that means to produce a new direction. And one of the directions is, the hidden labor. The mother, let us say, or Rick, is it the father these days, who tell them, Rick, how much work it takes to get the baby to know that his mouth and his ear, and that's his voice inside. By the time we know those kind of things, somebody's done a lot of labor. And so Derrida always critiques for the hidden move through the other, or the space of the other. The other one, to my mind, is the machine. That the auto-affective circuit disavows the circuitry. That if you think between mouth and ear, even this space, or the space of timing of learning from the mother or something, the spacing and timing both does 2 things. It both breaks up the unity or the continuity that is imagined when you hear it in your head, and also makes it apparently so. Does that work for you? Because it's 2 things at once, the machine. It both brings things together, and if you can't see them, it looks like they've always been together. Let's say, so if you have to go and show the machine, you have to go show the timing and the spacing, then you would see that it also breaks. Now, I'm using the notion of machine here somewhere between Derrida's notion, which is much closer to Lacan, I think, and so we're going to do that. And Deleuze's and Guattari's, and then anti-Oedipus, and then pass that to Deleuze's philosophy. If you want to know anything that I'm saying that doesn't make sense, just tell me. So I just learned all this myself, so I don't know. So their idea of machine is just that, breaking into flows of energy and matter, but connecting that makes for connection, and also disconnecting and changing the direction. And I don't know what you mean by prehistory, but they're very interested in sub-individual machines, well, beneath the subject, if not beneath almost everything. We think having a lot to do already with computers, because computers are now enabling us to see order where we saw chaos, as you may know, in vortexes, things we always pointed to. So there's a great interest from Derrida to Deleuze, and I'm not going to touch on Foucault till we get to bodies. And he's not as interesting to me for a variety of reasons, because, I mean, he's very, he's very, well, okay. So, because I'll go off and I'll never get anywhere. Oh, please, yeah.
I read the Age,
Yeah.
And I couldn't quite understand why he calls it a machine. I understand why what he's getting at.
Right.
But I never thought of these areas as being mechanical.
I know. Because they're not just mechanical, because he says they're not. Well, first of all, he doesn't, and I may not spend a long time with you on this right now, because I want to do this part, and then we'll go, but it's a good question. Because I'm not, I know your feeling. I think it's machinic he likes to use, you might remember. It's not actually machine, M-A-C-H-I-N. But there is all those sections that say a machine is.
It could be also the way the 19th century conceived of machines.
And he doesn't mean that.
I believe that George would support me on this. I may be wrong here, but were there certain paintings, enormous paintings that were sort of machines?
Yeah, well, that was a term that was used in getting confused with the data sex machine.
Yeah, this is, they use machines certainly as if, and I'm doing an interpretation here, so, that also raises this question. They do, because although I may not have really an original idea, I am trying to be original about my reading. And you raise a great question. I have trouble all the time understanding, too, because all of these thinkers are interested in playing with a word to take you away from all your usual understandings of the word. And they define machines, and I'm taking their definition as just what I said, directing and redirecting the flow of energy. I think we'll go eventually through Heidegger here, because you got to go sooner or later. I can do it in 5 minutes, I promise, because I don't go through all of it. But I think, of course, that they're interested in talking about machines at a very smaller level, and then they go on and build those big ones that we more recognize as machines, and they finally get to the social machine or even the car or the toaster. But at first, they like that low. And for me, that's also about a framing device, something that holds something together or breaks it up. So Derrida's whole interest in devices, rhetorical devices. To me, there's a movement about the machine. Now, to answer your question another way, and not about Deleuze.
I don't want to tell you that it wasn't the center of my thoughts that day. It's what I read. I remember the beginning.
No, I agree.
When you book in the very first line, Mr. Clough, you know you're in trouble.
Isn't the first, yeah.
And I said to myself, a machine is, for example, our emotions, machine mind, is an interview with a meeting with a friend, a machine.
I think.
But then I understood what you were getting at. I mean, I decided.
And they're also certainly non-human. See, they are playing certainly on the notion of rethinking the relationship between the human and the non-human. At a moment when surely machines, as we take them regularly to be like computers, are certainly producing certain kinds of agencies that just ridiculously we would be speaking to say, oh yeah, but the human being programs it. There's things going on in computers that gives them an interesting sort of notion of agency. So I'm going in that direction, but let me answer you, because I want to stop that for a minute, if I may, because I'm going to try to tell you what Derrida does with machines. So you'll get how then, what he does with reading them. But I do think we're looking here at what they call I don't want to say anti-humanism, but moving away from a humanist point of view, where the human being is the privileged figure. Notice that thing about auto-affection is certainly a privilege of the subject in Western thought. And the machinic, or the circuitry, or the things that do the connecting, or the things we lean on and then don't want to remember from the mother on, or whatever, and even before that, looking, I won't do that. So, the sort of movement of chance and necessity that we always disavow when we do a starting point. We start here, but all the stuff that goes before so they were looking at those kind of things. So I'm going to say to you that I think for cultural studies that the last 3 decades of cultural criticism has probably ended at least, because we are at a kind of end in cultural studies. Ended, I don't mean forever, but at certain moments at the end certainly. Ended at least with thought tensed between auto-affection and the machine, I'd say. On one hand, identity politics, I want to hear my own voice, I want to be in my own voice, I want my own representation. One could, and this enormous interest, including my own, in autobiography and, right. Now, all of those already have framing devices, so they're not pure auto-affection, but it goes in that direction. Then on the other side, there is, of course, all the deconstruction that went on for the last 3 decades of breaking every identity down into its machinic parts or something, but also interest in the old machine, cinema studies, television studies, all of which got sort of collected in cultural studies. So I do not give up on either side. My book is this mixture of these kind of essays about Derrida and actually autobiographical prose poems. So I am sort of, playing around with being truly unable to pretend that I don't really love hearing my own voice when I'm speaking. So it's not quite what they meant, but So Derrida in this piece about Freud, and I forgot to look up the dates for you. Now it's gone, and when it was in the French, I'm not forgotten, is interesting to me. I read it in 1983, and in 1983, I actually met Randy in 1983. Did you know that? At Social Text, right?
Yeah.
In
Originary moment.
Yep. That was the most important part about 1983. In 1983, I went to that famous conference in cultural studies in the United States anyway, Marxism and the Study of Culture. And actually, the pink book that you may see around the Bible of Cultural Studies was the last few days of that conference, but it was 6 weeks long. And I was there studying with Frederick Jameson, Gayatri Spivak, Stuart Hall, Larry Grossberg, Perry Anderson, Julia Lesage, could you do better, and some others every single day for 6 weeks, Saturday, Sunday, in the bedrooms, out in the bar. Really, at the moment that people on the sort of Marxist side of things were really, really engaged with post-structuralism in a way that was non-trivializing. They were taking it seriously. They weren't giving into it completely, but, so I learned a lot very fast. What's the name of that thing? I think it's called I think it's by the same title as the conference. Marxism and the Cultural...
and the Interpretation of Culture.
Interpretation of Culture. It's Carrie Nelson, thank you, and Larry Grossberg. University of Illinois, where I happen to have gotten my PhD, and where I studied cybernetics. See, I have a sort of techie head. So I was one of the oldest people at that conference, even though I was just, very young. But there were very young people there, because of course it was another generation that was really interested in that stuff. And I also had a little kid, and I must have read, I don't remember how many books I read. I was so happy to be on my own reading and listening to people talking. But it was also a problem for me. I was a sociologist, I still am, but without tenure, and reading what I read did not help me very much, let me tell you. But I continued on. And in 1983, the other autobiographical interest was I started psychoanalysis. And I have been, or was in, psychoanalysis for about 14 years with the same person. And somehow I've always thought that my affection for post-structuralism really had a lot to do with being in psychoanalysis while I was reading it, because the influence of psychoanalysis on post-structuralism is monumental. That doesn't mean they love it, but it's huge. They're always in the discussion and always interested in the unconscious, if not Freud's, some other one. And I've been looking for that other one, just so I could get out of analysis probably, but, and the other was machines. I was always interested in machines, so I started to notice as soon as I read Derrida that it was all over the place. Cybernetics, tele-technology, from the grammatology on this, everywhere Derrida says, this is the condition of possibility that I'm doing this. It's cybernetics. They don't get it right, of course, but it's that spread. In his most recent works, he really gets quite explicit about it. Well, no, because he never gets explicit on anything. But in the Freud piece, which I'm going to actually do for you quickly, I really loved it because I loved what he said about machines. And again, maybe we'll say we don't know what they are, but this is what Derrida says, and I've been influenced by it. And I'll tell it to you before I run through it. Derrida says that machines offer rhetorical devices. I mean, we use machines as metaphors, right? No surprise. But that's interesting for Derrida to really say that, as you'll see, that there's something outside metaphors, and he sort of plays with Freud for not noticing that there were machines in the world. And he talks about the world. So I'm sort of, because some people think Derrida never sees a world or never sees anything like that. So I want to show you that. But he also implies, and this is really what I got out of, that there's a history, what he calls a shared history between the text, the psyche, and technology. And that, at even ends of ethnography, is doing that. I've always thought, what is that history? Psyche, text, technology. What could it mean to talk about historical periods in which the psyche would be different and how it goes on? This is what I'm after, and I don't know the answer, actually. But someday. No, I'm kidding. I don't, actually, but I'm searching. Okay, so let me tell you a little about that piece. The second piece is by Kaja Silverman, because in 1983 I met Julia Lesage. I really was deeply influenced by those 6 weeks. Julia Lesage was editor of Jump Cut, a feminist rag about cinema, which is really interesting. And so I got interested in feminist film theory, which was very seriously engaged with Lacan. And in 1976, I was pregnant, I remember. I got my PhD in 76, and I got pregnant. And then I started to go to the new... What? Are you all right?
Yeah.
So I started to go... It all goes together. I started to go to... I came to New York, was pregnant, was teaching somewhere, and started to go to the new school for classes. And I studied with Stuart Schneiderman, which is he's the only Lacanian analyst in the United States who trained with Lacan. Why I was, I remember one day thinking, Patricia, you have a PhD, you don't have to go to school anymore. And I left, so I never finished the course, but I think I wasn't ready. What made me interested in Lacan, I don't remember. Maybe it was Juliet Mitchell, but I can't quite figure it, but I did get very interested in Lacan. So, and film theory, because I liked the connection of Lacan and machines. Anyway, in 1992, Kaja Silverman, 1992, everything is autobiographical for me. 1992, Age of Ethnography was published, and so was Kaja Silverman's monumental book, Masculine Sexualities on the Margin. It is a brilliant, huge book. No one cared, because somehow, Kaja Silverman, it happens to us. Kaja Silverman wrote a book, and the politics of cultural studies have become very engaged in questions of race, class, gender, and the intersection, as you must hear. And this book is not like that. And no one cared about psychoanalysis anymore suddenly, even though it had been so hot. There was this So right after that, Kaja Silverman in 1993 writes this piece, What is a Camera, that is really quite amazing. And so I'm going through it because no one paid attention to it because it was already over. And both pieces, I want to sort of argue, are about television. Her piece, but wait till you see, this is a very sort of whimsical sort of thing. Okay, so how do I do it? Well, Derrida's piece has a line in it, and assume you didn't, memorize it anyway, if you read it. And I'll tell you what page, though, in case you want to go back and look. 228. He says, in Freud's discourse opens itself to the theme of writing. Results in psychoanalysis being not simply psychology, nor simply psychoanalysis. And I'm a little bit after that. What did Derrida find in psychoanalysis, which is, has been spoken about before, and what was this field beyond psychoanalysis that psychoanalysis opened to, and playing around with this. And I said, and Derrida is going to imply that Freud's being pulled in his thought by some machine, and I'm going to play the same game on Derrida, that he's being pulled by a television, okay? And when he complains that Freud can't bear to know it, I'm going to say, well, of course, neither can Derrida. Who wants to think that you're being pulled by a television? Because even though he talks about television, I'm not sure he, loves it like I do. I love television. Just an addiction. I mean, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. You don't die from it. Okay. Derrida is interested in this wonderful thought. I remember when I read it, I did not understand this piece until recently. I love reading Derrida because every once in a while you read it again and you think, whoa, you didn't get that. You didn't get that the first time. So I think you make them up a lot of times because they're not. It's just not easy. It's true. So, but what a fantastic idea. He thought he would go through all of Freud's metaphors for the unconscious or the psyche. And he would trace them historically. And I'm sure, that he had, jumped up and down, laid on the ground when he found out that the last one that that Freud had picked was the mystical, magical writing pad. You know what it is, that thing we write on, then you lift it up. And of course Freud liked it. You can see why, no matter what you know about psychoanalysis. Or he liked it for two reasons. And I'm taking what I'm saying to partly from knowing Freud, but pretty much because Derrida goes through this in the piece, okay? Freud liked it because Freud wanted something that would have infinite capacity for reception. I'm a very concrete thinker. When I read words like reception and think of television, I start to let some little piece go off here by itself. So reception, infinite capacity for reception, because Freud equates psyche with memory. The memory is what we're talking about. Okay, psychic memory or memory, and of course you want someplace where things just stay there forever. But if you need to collect forever, to put in the memory forever, let us say, then you have to have some surface that's virginal, as Freud puts it, that can keep on collecting. So so he found it. You go like this, and it's free to collect. And I used to always read this to mean that underneath, because, and I do want to say this to you. I say in the paper that I was doing psychoanalysis while I was reading this. So I also was intrigued to see how it felt, because nobody, does. Kaja Silverman, all those people I always used to ask, are you in psychoanalysis? No. They read it, but they're not in it. So I was always sort of interested in what the difference would be. And I had a really smart analyst, because, otherwise you could learn almost nothing. But she's great. And she read too, and we, she read things too, so we could talk about them. So one of the gifts of my analysis was that she didn't make the fact that I like to think a sign of my insanity, which I had been through other people who thought that surely it was. I hope you won't, but I'm vulnerable now. So or she's crazy too, so that worked out just fine. So the first one that Freud takes is the one on the, I used to take the underneath to be, and Freud says the underneath, the slab, is the unconscious. And I used to think it was interesting from analysis that you know, if you ever see them underneath because your kid had them or something, you had it, right? You could go to a point and maybe start following the line, but then you'd be off on another line because you no longer could see the original direction. So one would shift off to another, but you'd have this maybe a little spot where they went. And it's very like pre-association, like the analysis of one's unconscious. There is no returning in analysis of a real sort to any originary place. No analyst ever says your mother or should or can really, maybe they do. I can see it now, I see your mother when you were 3. I mean, you cannot go back there. There is nothing being dealt with. I mean, this is, pretty classic psychoanalysis, although a chatty analyst I had, but couch stuff, there is only the language. There's only what you're saying. There's only what you're dreaming. There's only movement from one kind of talking to another kind of talking to another kind of talking to body a little bit or whatever. So I understood that bottom part, but I think now that I see Derrida was much more interested in seeing that Freud wanted those 2 levels, and it had something to do with perception and memory, which I was a little less aware of when I first read it. Freud starts on the neurons, the language. There's the neurology, is that language, and it's very interesting to me because people have always said things about Freud that part he got wrong, and he couldn't help it. It was so long ago, and Derrida says that too. Derrida says it's very interesting as a metaphor. But it turns out that if you look at, I think it's, and I'm no expert here, maybe you are, connectionist theory is in psychology now, that it's kind of interesting what Freud said and what they're learning about neurons. So I have a little insert about all of that here. I won't bother you with it, but the critique is always that Derrida is very uninterested in biology. So social people like us or Marxists or stuff like that always went to it because they thought for sure that Derrida was deconstructing what appears natural. Notice the natural circuit. Instead, you want the machine. But I find Derrida's work not to be against biology, and so that's part of my reading, to talk about what he calls fusus indifference, the more I'll explain it when we get there, the relationship between nature and culture under the regime of the machine. Okay, so, but I'm just inserting there that some of the new readings in psychology have noted a certain interest of the way Freud talks. Now, this is what Freud says about the neurons. He says, because it's very clever what he says, given, when I work with cyberneticians, nobody knows what's going on in the brain, but they want to know what's going on in the brain to put it in the machine. And that whole interaction is so fascinating, because you put stuff in the machine and you say, maybe that's how we work. It's working over there. It's also how sometimes the machine can do things we'll never do, even though we started that off somehow, which is a little eerie, is it not? So machines are always scary. They're sexy. They have all those kind of threats involved to mixing the wrong stuff, the wrong mixtures, right? Okay. He's imagining what must be going on. He has no way of knowing. And he says that, and there are other models around, he rejects them all. He wants to say that the neurons, their primary function is when there's excitation, the neuron usually discharges energy so that it won't overwhelm, let us say. But there's a secondary function of not discharging energy, but almost storing it, or let us say resisting the discharge. And Freud actually says, so a little path is opened up, sort of to where you might put the energy, or send it off somewhere. And he says it happens at the connectors between neurons, okay? The little connector resists and sends the energy off somewhere. Here, I hear my machines coming in there, and of course, yes. But Freud says there something interesting here, though, because when the energy is sent off, it leaves a trace on that neuron. Be careful, don't write that because it's not right yet. Neuron, and that gives it a susceptibility to conduction, so that it might become one of the ones that keeps on sort of reproducing some trace. However, to make it all difficult, but this is where Derrida gets difficult, Freud says the traces can't be left on the neurons. I mean, it's not like something that's really there. Why? Because don't forget, Freud wants to be able to have the virginal surface. So he knows that the traces must be there, but they must also not be there. And Derrida loves that. You know why? Because Derrida has a notion called différance, and this is his first experience of it with Freud, which means, on one hand, deferral, putting off. Not letting come to an end, not let there be a beginning, but always sort of deferred, metaphor and actual. And it also is the term from Freud, and I'll get to that from the Wolfman story of deferral. And differing, constantly differing from oneself. Now this is an old idea, but I truly love it. It has wonderful political implications all around. That is, anything that has an identity has it because it also is different from itself, right? It separates from itself, or in producing an identity, it disavows its own difference from itself. Here I am. Well, no, I was somebody else just a few minutes ago, and yesterday. No, here I am. And I am just as I am now, the way I was yesterday. At least I know my fingernails were, no, not, so we want to be able to say, auto-affection, yes, I am what I was yesterday. I know it, I picture, people tell, but we do a lot of work actually to do that. And we do denials or disavowals of differences. And then we can do other kinds of bigger ones, like Derrida's connected with a deconstruction of the white heterosexual property-bearing subject of Western thought, because Western thought subject was always pictured, according to him, because there's debate, according to him, as someone who expresses himself, who knows himself, who can know. And Derrida says that all the messy stuff, let us say, that keeps us from ever knowing or really knowing or knowing ourselves, and it never ends because we don't, gets displaced onto other figures like the woman, what a mess she is, or the colonized, or the person of color. So there's those kind of deferrals and displacements, all right, that goes into différance. The difference has two meanings, active, seeing an identity because it has deferred other things. So you deconstruct it to see the other things. And also seeing the identity. That identity actually does occur. I mean, it is illusionary, maybe we like to say, but it happens in that deferral. We do think we are us, and it's quite substantial, the implications. Right. Where am I? Who knows? Anyway, I'm thinking about. So Derrida says that Freud is indicating here something interesting, that the little neurons must be deferring. I mean, they're refusing to discharge energy, and they're sending the energy off somewhere else. But it's actually a matter of timing, too, because it's the differences between all the neurons doing it. Be patient, I know this is complex and it's not really the most interesting part, but because it's the contact that makes the decision. So it's almost as if, Derrida says, there's a machine here where there's a whole network of things sending things off and things holding things on, but everything is timing. It's always in motion, and so that the virginal surface comes from the fact that it's always in motion, not that there's things actually in. So if I could jump from there, Derrida says that Freud is actually looking for the potential for memory, that the psychic is a machine that produces the potential for remembering. It is not the place you keep memory. So this is how the argument goes. There's not like memories in there, but the making of a memory machine, making the gears, making the connections, unmaking. So Freud says, Derrida says, when will Freud actually think that it's not just the neurons that are, acting like a little machine, but he'll start thinking of the whole apparatus as a machine. Because he doesn't at first. At first he's just looking at the neurons and how they act, and they're like little writing apparatuses. They either write something that way or they don't write at all. But he doesn't quite see the whole apparatus until he sees this, the writing pad. When Freud sees the writing pad, he then says the whole psyche is a writing machine. The whole thing operates at all times to make differential traces for memory. Okay, let me look a little. Here's I read you a little bit of stuff. Derrida emphasizes that for Freud, it is the difference in the resistances, the different spacing of the traces and the opened up paths that makes psychic memory possible. This is the neuron. So he's looking for what makes psychic memory possible. And then he says, memory is not pure breaking open of paths that might be reappropriated at any time as simple presence. It is rather the ungraspable and invisible difference between the breaches, really a matter of timing, when a neuron saves and when it doesn't. All right. Derrida then emphasizes, and I like this idea a lot, it's also Deleuze's idea, originary repetition. Okay. If the psyche is a matter of timing and the machine that always can negotiate what comes to it, like a machine of timing, saving things, sending things, holding things, moving things, then it doesn't so much, it isn't interesting for what it has, but that it constantly reproduces the potential for repeating, that things can be repeated. But the repetition is pure. What does this mean? It means there's no original. There's only repetition, always repetition. Think the thought. It's really worth thinking the thought. If you think the old-fashioned way, that things are reproducing something, then this is not really repetition in a pure form, because everything's only that thing, another version of it. But to actually see the meaning of repetition or the interval between repetitions, you should have nothing that it's repeating. You should just have a capacity for repetition. Yeah?
I'm not even sure what you're saying. Can you repetition in kind of a Jungian way, like an archetype?
No, I never mean Jungian anything.
Or do you mean it in a way that the experience is there is no pure experience, as you said earlier, and so there's only an interpretation of it, and then that is what you...
Yes, we're always, now I want to be careful about interpretation, but just as, we'll have to be a little, just as I was saying in psychoanalysis, the analyst actually is thinking she's repeating with you all the things you constantly repeat anyway, all your compulsions to repeat. The whole point of analysis, why it takes, so many years is, well, who knows why, but is because one has to finally repeat the repeating with the analyst, okay? And then it can be seen as a repetition. But no one can really go back and see, let us say, when it starts. So this is a theory that's taking that quite seriously. Now, you may say, who cares? It's my job to tell you why you should care about this. I'm just doing the abstraction with you, which is not so much fun. I'm sorry, but try. Because the notion is that if there's nothing in the first place, and we're always already in repetition, we can start looking at the psyche as a productive mechanism for doing things rather than a container for stuff. And this will give a very different idea for what the unconscious does as well. Okay?
But if it's that there's no original thing that we repeat, or is it that without an additional thing, there's no, is it the idea of a pattern? So there's no pattern until there's
Yes.
another episode. And
Right,
then it becomes
right,
repetitive.
right. It's not a repetition of a pattern. It's repetition that gives pattern.
Right.
That's right. Thank you.
What about the events that occur? What is the repetition of? So if somebody's raped as a child, physically, actually, are they repeated? Are they repeating something or just repeating the repetition?
Do you mind if I go on a little
No,
bit
okay.
and we come back to that, because it's, you know, it's the stopper question of moving through but I do know the question. But let's put it let me answer you at least as I just did. You understood what I just said, right? And it is interesting if you're doing ontology, not therapy, but ontology of, you know, what do we say is at the beginning? And if it's not being, but a capacity for repetition or a timing, spacing thing, why would we suddenly have this new shift about ontology? So I told you before, because I think something about the kinds of machines that are doing memory work now that is starting to influence all the way back to the philosophy of being itself and what being is. You know, there was God, there was being, you know, this may be one of those big moments where we think of something as originary, that's repetition. Derrida, of course, says when you call repetition originary, you have to cross it through and put an X through it, because it couldn't possibly be originary as presence is. So he really means, if you want to, the flux of pre-individual forces of chance and necessity, taking chaos a little more seriously, to use some of those terms, than an already formed figure. About the event, let's get to it. I won't forget it, but it isn't about just saying, no, there's no events. It's about where you're going to start. And we often take starting points for granted in our analysis of things, not to mention our lives. So it's not a denial of things, it's a different starting point. It is true that psychoanalysis, for instance, and you know, this is not what's interesting to me about psychoanalysis, might argue that no one experiences an event, as you just said it. That no one just experiences a rape. I think that. That's not to say one doesn't experience something, but that it's not just a rape. In fact, I would think, you know, think of always Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye, incest rape, that one of the reasons rape, we shouldn't get off on this, but it's an old, you know, it's the old question that's always raised. And I see the rape already a repetition of other things, and that's why it hurts so much. You know, so if you think of incest, that's an interesting one to do. All right. Derrida is now moving towards thinking of the psychic apparatus as a network of differential moves and speeds, and Freud comes to it too. Okay? I won't, let me say this. Derrida's work on difference comes slightly after the piece of Freudian writing, and I want to read you a little Derrida because it's interesting. Derrida puts it this way: an interval must separate the present from what it is not, for the present to be itself. But this interval that constitutes it as a present must by the same token divide the present in and of itself, thereby also dividing along with the present everything that is thought on the basis of the present, that is, in our metaphysical language, every being and singular substance of the subject. In other words, for there to be a present, the present must also be in the past, right? And for there to be a past, there also has to be a present past. You can play with it that way a little bit, okay?
Isn't it philosophy of the present?
No, it isn't. But don't make me do that one, please. because otherwise we won't get to a punchline here. Okay, then Derrida goes on and looks at the language of the dream and the hieroglyphics of the dream. And this is maybe more familiar to you that Freud always argued that you cannot translate a dream. Cannot translate a dream. Because dream language has its own private grammar. Now, people do things with dream analysis, of course, but not translation. And Derrida says translation, so who cares what the words really mean, but the meaning here is translation obliterates the materiality of the signifier. If you think of the word dog in English and the word dog in French, the words lose their material look, right? So he's playing around with that the only way to produce the materiality of a signifier is poetry. Again, you get the timing and the spacing and the moods and the feel. He then likens translating the unconscious that way as well. One is moving to consciousness, but again, no text is there in the unconscious that can get interpreted to mean something that's always there. It's not a repository place where something could ever just sit there and we'd constantly have to translate it. There may be forms of repetition that one uses to do everything one does, but not content. And Derrida finds this not just for himself, of course he's looking, but he finds it in Freud. Freud says the language of dream thoughts and dream content are utterly two different languages. Dream thoughts are, what you say about the dream after you started analyzing. And the dream content, anyone who's done dream analysis a lot, or, had it done on them, or however you put that, you can barely say your dream before you hear yourself saying, oh my God, he's changing. He doesn't look like that anymore. Dreams don't sit still. They constantly sort of undo themselves. All right. Now, I want to spend just a second here with the notion of text, because this is the most abstract thing I'm going to do with you. I promise the rest is much more close to cultural studies. Derrida has already written the sentence, there is nothing outside the text. There is no outside text. And I'm sure you have heard somebody say how ridiculous this remark is, that everything in the world is just a text, right? And this is one of the big critiques of Derrida. Again, where are the events? Where is life? It's just a text. Well, of course, Derrida never, it's absolutely clear that Derrida never meant written text when he said text, ever. You might have to start with text because people know that it's a written text, but he meant something else. But I'm very interested here in making you see that we just finished a whole piece where Derrida is trying to talk about there is no text. There is no ur-text. There's no primary text. There's no event that becomes a primary text. There is nothing that's primary in that sense in the psyche. So when he says there's nothing outside the text, he couldn't possibly mean that there's some text and everything is in it, or there's even two texts and everything is in it. In fact, what he meant was that there is no one text, surely, but that doesn't just mean, and here I hope this is good for you because this is stuff that will come up in cultural studies, nor does it mean that there are many readings to the text, which people have pinned on him all the time as relativist, because many readings to the text still says there's a text. What Derrida means by text is, and he says it, is an identity that has been made, if you mean this text, a closure from difference. You've produced a text, and every text can be deconstructed to return again to what you've disavowed. Okay, so that's the difference, but he's mostly interested in talking about a network of traces, a network of differences that exist. I'm not sure where, but certainly sub-individual, so I don't think it has much to do with what we think of as meaning and interpretation at all, but much more, I'm ready to say this, and God knows you probably, hope you're with me, much more a pulling down of being with a capital B into finite forces of chance and necessity. He says it. Let me try again for you. We have tried to say that there's no origin, there is no being, there is no thing, and with the capital B, and at least with Heidegger, it's not God, but it's, the being of ontology. And that everything comes from it. It's what your notion of event rests on. It always allows us to think there is a presence first, and then all the machines, the framing devices, the circuitries come after. Derrida is trying to take all the things that come after and put it not first, because he's against firstness, because firstness will produce presence. So he talks more about pulling down firsts into movements and chaos and weaves of networks, which he sometimes refers to as telecommunications, weaves of communicating networks. One more step there. So I wanted to say to you that the notion of text is very complicated in post-structuralism and opens to ontological issues everywhere. And certainly the literature people, excuse me, those of you who are, made something out of this that is not totally inappropriate, because he went through readings of philosophers and their texts, let's say. But literary people too quickly, I think, turned Derrida into, there are many readings, this is how you do a reading, even deconstructive readings. Not wrong, but more interesting things could be drawn from it, I think. And need to be now, only because that certainly has a dead end. And I think it will help us when we get more concrete, if you're still with me, of dealing with machines like television and movie cameras and that kind of thing. Derrida says all those opposite... Oh, let me say one other thing. The notion of textuality is also defined as every text produces a context. Now this again goes back to your event. It actually appears in a piece called Writing Some Context and Event. And it's Derrida's debate with John Searle. And it's a great, great debate on the notion of signatures, events, text, and stuff. And in that piece, which is loaded, if you know the piece, with terms about telecommunications all over the place. The word is used, it's thought. Derrida has the notion, again, of repetition. If I have to speak to you, and you have to understand me, right? What I have to say must move through contexts. It must be able to get out of the context that it starts in, let's say, and get to another context over there. You see how hard you're struggling to context what I'm saying. So everything he plays, everything to have meaning in communication would certainly, by its very rule, have to break a context. The rule would be to be outside, to be able to move through context. Not, he says, and this is why Derrida is so annoying, but it's so good because he's so careful in many ways. Not because you ever have a text, and now I'm talking about a smaller text, outside of a context. He doesn't say that. They're not floating around outside. But that no context has a center or an anchor. No context holds something down. Things are always in movement. Now, I hope you understand that I'm looking for where this is going besides what it means. I'm looking for why does someone write this kind of stuff like he's writing. Because I think there's a machine out there pulling him to write this kind of stuff. I mean, he's also working at it off of, he's gone back to redo philosophy, but why? Why? Well, he has his reasons, I'm sure, but I think he also knows he's being pulled a little bit. The notion of making a context every time is very interesting. It's very hard on social science. They have their ability to talk about multiple readings, multiple meanings, taking the viewpoint of others, taking the other's viewpoint always rests on the notion of a given context. They assume one, almost always somewhere. then they may move things around after that. There is no beginning context here. Text is the making possible of a context. Not the other, again, it's the reversing again instead of the other way around. The production is the thing that produced the context and will have to be broken. Let me read this ugly little thing here. This is always hard, but this is very important. You may have heard this before. The deconstruction of the text is the deconstruction of the opposition of insight. Let me start just a bit earlier. The production of a text and its deconstruction cannot be severed. I'm going to go all the way back. Derrida actually may have already written, "There is nothing outside the text." There is no outside text. The infamous sentence appearing in Grammatology, published the year after Freud and the Scene of Writing is first published. So often misunderstood to mean that there is no reality or even any materiality that much matters, or that there is no meaning but what is given in written text. The sentence, "There is nothing outside the text," must be read along with "There is no present text," a text nowhere present in the psyche. Even when addressing the deconstruction of the literary text, Derrida terms are the same terms used in relationship to the psychic production of a text. The deconstruction of the text as a book or finished corpus of writing, Derrida argues, opens up to a differential, quote, differential network, a fabric of traces referring endlessly to something other than itself, to other differential traces. So I hope you can feel that we've moved something out into the world that Derrida first started to find in Freud as the unconscious in the individual. Because in some sense Derrida's moving the unconscious in the individual, and I will talk more about it, out into the world as the substrate, let us say, he's going to say, of machines and technology. An unconscious outside of the subject is exactly what I think the unconscious of tele-technology is. So no matter the apparatus, the production of the text is the becoming literary of differential traces. That's good for you English people because you see, you usually think the text is already there, but the becoming literary of that differential traces is what is the making of a text and of literature. And that does open to interesting politics about what is the canon and all this stuff. It's not that it isn't, but you know, we've done that, right? The production of the text and its deconstruction cannot be severed from a connection to the psychic apparatus grasped as a writing machine, where there is only text production without an outside text. The point is that without the outside text, or the or text, the psychic productions of text is the condition of possibility of memory, life, materiality, and meaning. Derrida actually says, and so does Freud, that when the neurons defend against excitation and do their stuff, they produce life. They're not protecting life, but that which is protected becomes life. And eventually Derrida says, therefore, death is also in life. I'll do that later. It is to shift the understanding of identity applied in the idea of materiality, text, world outside. He is asking about the spacing and timing of these, so just to displace their beingness with the thought of the machine. The deconstruction of the text is the deconstruction of the opposition of inside and outside, and that's the big one on text and context, inside and outside. The text has no outside, Derrida proposes, because the text makes its outside from inside. By producing the outside, the text attempts to close itself off, although it fails. The constitutive outside of the text that you pushed out cannot be inside the text. So this always keeps the text open, because that which you defined as outside is haunting at the inside. And this is all Derrida's work that you may be more familiar with. But this failure is disavowed and displaced, and a supplementary machine or production by a text of an origin and end. Let me just do that one because it's really important. It's our punchline. When you make the outside, man is man because women is a lumpa. Of course, the outside can then not be in man. You know, Arnold Schwarzenegger. all man, nothing left of the feminine. But you know, it doesn't take much to think it's shadowing around someplace, because the outside, if there's everything in the text, then you can't have an outside, but it's there. So Derrida over and over again says that this outside is disavowed and some origin is invented. That sort of is an outside that starts the text off, but has a being greater than the text production. You can see where he's going now. And look at what he calls some of it. But this failure that you needed a machine to push something out in order to then produce that purity of being as if it was the origin, that's the machine he wants. And I'm going to read you something else, but when Freud has this writing machine going, he says, and I love this, he says, you know, after they put the stuff, after all that stuff goes on the wax, the thing that bothers me about the writing machine, Freud says, is it can't work on its own. The stuff that's underneath can't come back up to consciousness like the real psyche does. And Derrida says, that is so sad for the little machine. Here Freud has this finite thing called the psyche. It's not God. And his own finite thinking, he needs a machine to understand it. And then when he gets there, he goes, shoo, shoo, get away. And suddenly the psyche's not finite anymore. It can work on its own. Not with his theory holding it up, not with all of 19th century Europe holding it up. All these disavowals, it works on its own suddenly. The Derrida says, let us keep the little machine. Let the machine be inside the psyche. Let the machine be inside life. And if it is death, as we like to think machines are, then death is inside life as well. And it's very condition of possibility, which of course, you know, as we get older, we know it's the only thing we really get to know about all this, right? That Freud fails to love his machine right to the end, of course, is a little trick I pull on Derrida too, because he doesn't know. Oh, I'm not getting anywhere here fast, but okay. Derrida also then talks about telecommunications, of course, because if you don't have a context first, and if you don't have text, then things are all just moving through networks of information. And with globalized tele-technology, it's sort of fascinating. Oh, I wanted to say, if you have a computer and you see things come up out of there, I mean, when I was reading that line way in 1983, I thought, if he had a computer, could he have said that it can't come back? Now, I know you think, and I do too, that humans are slightly different than computers, but just think how much closer the mechanism gets to a description here. I wanted to remind you of screen memory too, that Freud had this notion that, and this is your event idea too, now that this may not satisfy you, but this is, you know, another thought about it, that traumas are produced after the fact. And he had the notion of the primal scene, that a child seeing parents or hearing parents' sexuality can't quite make it an event. And later something else might happen that the trauma is produced, or the feeling of trauma, but one never really knows the primary scene. One never really, even if one can see things, one is not sure what one sees, or that it's the primary scene, or it's the scene that started you off to make fantasies, which is what Freud thinks, that those sounds and stuff begin a fantasy life in the child, which we're not going to get to, but is in here. Let me just, because I don't know how my time's going here. I want to say one thing, because it's important. Derrida is talking about the machine and having a wonderful time with Freud, and then he does the oddest thing, given everything I've just said to you. He says, it's really interesting that Freud did not see that there were machines in the world, and certainly better ones than this thing, that were archiving memories and were already, you know, what was around for Freud, right? Telephone, yeah, movies. Now, Freud did talk about cameras and optical stuff, but he loved this writing machine the best. Why didn't he look at real machines? And then Derrida says things like,
the question of techne or technicity or the machine is not asked only or primarily within theoretical discourse, but within the history of the psychic tests and technology. And he says the metaphors that people take from the machine go beyond individuals. They go into a history of machine production. Now, when you talk history of machine production, because I hope you'll see the connection next time. When we talk Marxism, for instance, and we talk a history of technological development, you can all do it, right? First came to this, and then came to that, and then came to this. Now, if we're talking Derrida, talking about a history of machines, what happened to all this stuff we just suffered, and I made you suffer, identities are not, and deferrals, and how come we have a history of a machine? So I always sort of thought, whoa, what is going on here? Well, we have a little complexity here that intrigues me, actually. My argument is that technologies have a history, yes, and that each technology, and I found this in Jameson eventually, each technology produces a machine, a primary machine. Now here I'm using machine in a more old-fashioned way, and we'll go over it next time, and that machine, just like the ones we've been talking about, gets certain relationships of time and space. The reason Derrida is really trying to get the psychic and this world psyche to be a machine that moves and speeds along and things run through it and runs on it and the technology still stays there ready to do more and more is because there is one. There is one out there. There is one that's doing it. It's already doing it. And he is increasingly interested in computers, Derrida. And that machine is giving off all kinds of new metaphors, let us say, starting from scratch, all of philosophy, all of the social sciences, everything should have to be rethought. So Derrida says, if you think that way, then you think technologies must change the notion of materiality, the notion of physis versus techne. I'm doing Heidegger there, and we'll do it. The notion of the psyche, the notion of presence, the notion of origin. They must reconfigure them every time. Not just do away with it, but reconfiguring. Machines must give specific relationships of time and space. And for those of you who read some postmodernism, which we could mention, there's lots of talk about speed and the differences. Speed. Let me give you a quickie. Speed's not about travel. It's about knowing. That's a big difference to say that speed now gives us knowing. And we have not talked about capital yet, but we will. Derrida, if a machine gives the relationships of time and space, historically specifically, well, what the hell does it do to history then? So you have Derrida's famous aporia of time here. I'll say that again. If you want to say there's a history of machines, and he does, and I think we need to, but machines change the nature of history at different points, or the relationships of space and time, or speed and knowing, and materiality and stuff, then you can't say there is a history of the machine. Or, let us put it this way, what I would argue is that the history of the machine, at this moment and at other moments too, crosses through ontology. History of the machine ontologizes being, because the machine gives the relationships of time and space by which we grasp being in the first place. And ontology sort of stops you off from being able to really do a history of the machine, because the machine gives you time and space. So that Derrida uses the word aporia. It just goes wrong. It's difference. I mean, you eventually come back, but in a much larger sort of thing. Is this end everything, make things uninteresting? No. I think that...
How does a machine give the relationship of time and space?
Yeah. Well, because we're going to go backwards on that one, right? Because, I mean by backwards, that this is what he's been arguing about this machine, right? That the psyche is made up of temporal and spatial traces.
But not machines in general giving the relationship of time.
I am speaking machines in general when I'm speaking about the psyche.
Okay. Yeah, but you're talking about machines.
Yes, I did say that. You're right. You've got me. Because I don't know if I'm doing a good thing there.
because I think it's a little playful, but I'm doing it. When I get to tele-technology, I say the television is its machine, not the technology, but is the machine, and you'll see why I say that when we do it next time. But and there you say, but that's like a real machine. Well, where is television, though? I mean, I don't know if it's just that machine. Are you getting... So let me put it another way. Derrida refers to rhetorical devices and solid metaphors. You're interested, and I am too, in the solid metaphor. Which one comes first? He's implying here the solid metaphor, but then he undoes that in a sense, because you can't really know for sure that the history of the machine produces solid metaphors from which you get rhetorical devices. Okay, time and space machines. I define the machine as cutting off flows and directing them in some other way in the first place. So I think the machine is always about relationships of time and space. Maybe that's my definition that I'm drawing from this material, because I think there must be, when we get next time, Marx defines the machine as that which gives value to a commodity, or it works. Machines work. And I'm certainly, I think that my definition, Deleuze's definition of cutting off and redirecting and sending and building, let us say, a network, covers Marx, but Marx doesn't cover it.
What's the difference between a machine and an organism?
There isn't. No, absolutely.
So organisms and machines are organisms?
Yes, once we get to Deleuze and Guattari, we have bodies. Machines produce bodies. They make all kinds of bodies. Not human bodies, many bodies.
Well, what's the utility of the use of the word machine? If a tree is a machine, I follow what you say. The tree is a machine, and a pencil sharpener is a machine, and the
yes, but
the neurons are machines. How? I mean, this is a question, not a comment.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's the right question.
What's the utility of the distinction?
First of all, let's be careful, because we're also, I gave you one utility, but you want another one. One is that the shift in philosophy here to the sub-individual, all right, and to what an origin. Okay, so I mean, I tried to show you that this is a process that might ask us to think differently. Then I shifted and said there is a machine out there that's causing this, and that's when you're all getting, you know. So what you just asked me, remind me again quickly, because my mind went again. What's the utility? No, wait a minute. Yeah, wait. I did have an answer. I just have to be sure. Oh, wait. Oh. But why wouldn't there be utility? I'm trying to remember why I'm just having trouble remembering what I was just about to say to you. There is. Well, you know, I mean, I just, it's gone, and I feel so terrible because it certainly always gives smaller units. See, a tree is less interesting to me, although I certainly can. So you don't, the tree breaks down, of course, because Deleuze and Guattari is much more interested in, a tree is what they would call machinic assemblage. There are many machines there. So environmentally, you might talk about some of the smaller parts of things rather than huge things like a tree. Or you might see tree much more in relationship to everything else, right? But this is not what I wanted to say, and I'm really sorry. Certainly, there is a move away from organicism, okay? And in that sense, there's a utility in the metaphorical shift. And certainly there can be a question now about rethinking the relationship between human beings and machines, cloning, hooked up, wired. That we might start forming different kinds of unities
or opening and closing. I mean, certainly I can say that it lends a lot to reframing devices and rethinking. But I had something that I thought was more interesting to you as an answer, given some of the things you've said, but it went away from me. Certainly Derrida, one of the things I would just close with, Derrida's a little bit shy about saying what I said, that tele-technology is pulling his thought. Probably because of the kinds of troubles it produces, that it does make all this movement more stable or gives it a history more, which I'm giving it. He allows for the history, but he doesn't say much about it. And I think it's because he's a little uptight about television, actually. But I certainly think that one of the reasons I want to say that the unconscious is now moving out into tele-technology, and that's where thought happens, is certainly because I would like more people to start thinking that thought is not a human subject, but goes through the human subject. That there is thought outside the human subject, and there is agencies for thought outside the human subject. Certainly the unconscious, as Freud thought it, worked against the notion of the intentional subject, that the subject knew what it was doing, knew what it was thinking, was able to say. Never, never, never. The unconscious was always shaping and slightly behind the back. And even when one knows it, one doesn't see how it shapes. One's always producing through layers and screens of fantasy, like the Wolfman. Always. Okay, so here too, I think that it gives us a chance to look at where thought is happening. And maybe even seeing the tree completely differently than just a thing, or even an organic thing or a living thing, but actually a knowledge-producing thing, or a part of a different kind of structure. Really rethinking all the things we have identified as, movements. When Marx talks about technology, or Jameson does, it's going to be reduced to capitalist production. And I'm certainly looking for a way out of that. To talk about productivity that isn't only reduced to capitalist production. Because no doubt, once capitalism gets a hold of machines, of the kind we know, you can't talk machines without talking capitalism, because capitalism's had an enormous impact on the history of machines. And Derrida knows it.
Productivity beyond capitalism, I mean, machines will still be productive in the Marxian sense in pure communism.
By the way,
only capitalism takes the form of exchange value.
Did you? Well, yeah. So I mean, I have to talk a little bit about use value and exchange value, but. Did you notice that I shifted from Marx as quickly as I could to Jameson? Because it's Jameson who really reduces it to capitalist production. For this one especially, tele-technology is the technology of what he calls late postmodern capitalism. It's only a symptom. And so certainly I'm very interested in taking technology out of the symptom category and sort of treating it from an ontological perspective, giving it a lot more privilege than we usually want to do, because television is such a yucky machine, we think, not nice or it's not good. And so I'm very interested. Please go. So I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, and I'm sorry I can't think of what I wanted to say to you. So, well, I've gone too long. But I was afraid to stop because it's a very long sort of trajectory, and I didn't do the camera part, but that's fine. We can easily do everything else after this, because this is the hardest, but you'll see, I hope, that it will find its way back into other ways of shifting some other perspectives that are a little easier to deal with. The one thing about the camera piece that's really wonderful is that almost everyone took Lacan to say that there was a gaze, some sort of transcendental gaze, that showed itself on the screen and was identified with male characters. And Kasia Silverman, in this very long piece of rereading Lacan, shows that the gaze is on the lit-up screen, and of course it's a television by the time she's finished. And so this was the most frivolous of my readings, but a kind of move from beyond to there. Yes.
I have a couple of questions.
One, you never mentioned desire in, in your discussion here, which at least in terms of Deleuze and Guattari is pretty important in the relationship of understanding how the machines work. And I know you stayed a lot more on Derrida than Deleuze.
Because it's not here, it's somewhere else. Right? But go ahead,
well, at least within them, and thinking about the tree, there's a strong sort of ecological metaphor that runs through all of the machines, or their idea of the machine, the fact that they talk about in terms of and this is actually sort of a comment, because I thought of it in listening to what you said, that when they talk about machines and when they talk about the relationship with machines, they talk about flows of energy, like you said, and that's exactly the way ecologists would talk about an ecosystem, not in terms of individual parts, but the flow and exchange of energy.
Yeah, I thought that was certainly one answer, but I had a nicer thing that I really liked, and I just can't remember it. But by the way, desire. I'm having a hell of a time with that, though, because, Deleuze, I find Derrida easy, whether I convey that to you or not, than Deleuze and Guattari, because they sometimes, Derrida is not like they can get sometimes, so I get a little nervous, but desire in psychoanalysis is the desire that's always Oedipalized, right? It's always for your father, for your mother, some repetition of that. I'm certainly, my animals in my ear. I certainly know what it means to deny your Oedipus longings, and so I'm not interested in just doing that. But certainly, this move to get the unconscious is to get it out of the individual, and certainly Deleuze and Guattari move desire out of the individual, right? Desire in their work is something that does. And so when things when the machine and the flows start, they assume desire made the context for the machines and the flows. That may sound very strange, but there's no beginning to the desire, but once something's doing, we assume desire is all over the place. Now, I haven't finished thinking all of that stuff through, but it certainly intrigued me that a whole set of philosophical texts were interesting in thinking, and Spinoza is really an intertext here, right? So, we've thought this before, where there was continuity between substance and desire and everything else, except it seemed silly then. But now, since we have a technique that actually does it, it becomes an interesting idea again. Tele-technology, we're transforming matter into energy, into speed, into, all.
It's interesting to think about your observation as to Derrida's unease with television and the claim that there's nothing outside the text, on the one hand being very useful in getting us away from this inside-outside business. But when we start thinking about computers and telecommunications, it seems like one of the, if machines have to do with a certain principle of association of human relationship, that we can start saying is historical, can be different than what it is, can change. It's maybe a little more concrete and material than just talking about change through time. One of the things it seems to me we can say about computerization, telecommunications as a process, is it's very deliberately creating outsides, exclusions. That other project in which historically everything's to be inside, everything's going to be part of a modern developing world, to the extent that that's a project, not something that happens. There seems to be computerization, telecommunications seems to be announcing a different kind of global project to which whole populations are being excluded. And that sort of reinscribing a very determined difference between something inside and something left out, which is maybe interesting to talk about.
That takes us someplace. That always takes me to the question that are you not thinking that telecommunications is organized around capital there, though, aren't you? That what drives that exclusion's about profit making, right? But profit making is also driving to undo those exclusions too. I'm not so. you're asking, I would like to do this next time, but because it comes out, but you're asking me, is it bad or good?
No,
Oh, yes, you are. Yeah, you are. And I'm really trying not to think bad or good at the moment with tele-technology. I really am. It's not like I don't know how to. I really do. And I do think, and I think you're right, in Spectres of Marx, Derrida's afraid to do every little thing that I'm doing because he thinks tele-technology could be maybe very dangerous and he doesn't want to sound like an idiot. I mean that, because he also doesn't write that it's dangerous. His drive from the beginning to put the machine or technicity where physis was or where being was cannot now say, ooh, teles are bad. He can't do it. But he tries. Just like you want me to, and like I want to say, I know. But do we need to start off from use value, someone asked before, or from nature when we organize our critiques? So my answer is, we have to learn how to critique differential machinic relationships so that we do not deny the possibilities of technology as all bad and already recognize they are extensive to a point that to have a them and us, or it and us, or those of us who are wealthy and those who are, that we need something a little bit better, a little more subtle than that recognizes none of us are giving up our computer or watching television, let's say, or I don't know, or in chemical injections that keep us from dying, or plastic liver, give it to me and I know what color I want. Is that only the wealthy? No, and I also want everybody else to have a plastic one. That's for sure. So maybe we have a lot of oppositional thinking here about nature and machine, which I've been trying to break through. Event and repetition. That if you open it up to these rhythms, you really are asked. I've done nothing here with you today except that somebody asked me in a body of work to think everything differently, and I heard him. And I think there's a reason for it. I haven't done the thinking differently. We have some things, nation state is ending, family,
I might have a question to help me out.
Okay. I'm so mad I can't remember the answer to the last one.
Derrida's denials of presence and origin.
Deconstructing, not denials.
In those denials, and those no's, and also in the construction of the idea of response, and actually making it, where do you think his standpoint is? From what standpoint or what perspective can he see this and say, no? When astronauts went up to the moon, they could look back at the Earth and say, oh, it's a round blue thing. Perspective. You create a perspective so that you can see something new. Galileo looks through the telescope and sees, there's hills up there, there's dirt, probably rocks. So he's got an instrument so that the neighbors to see that, right? What do you think from your study of Derrida
my critic here.
that got it there? What standpoint did he get to be able to say these no's, no origin, no presence? Where did
No, I heard you from the start.
You get my sense of it.
Oh, definitely. Now before, so maybe we talk some other way for a minute. When I said that cultural studies over the last 3 decades at least have had this fight, right? You know this. Feminist and standpoint epistemology, and African American standpoint epistemology, queer standpoint epistemology. We've gone through all of them. Some using deconstruction, but in the long run, going back to some identity, very often, right? Deconstructing heterosexuality, but give me my identity, or deconstructing males, but give me my identity. And a lot of struggle, feminists arguing, no more deconstruction when it comes to us, please, because we need the perspective. And I don't know if you're asking that, but we can either undermine someone we distrust by saying, but what's your perspective, which we've now learned we can do, and or we can gain some political aspect. Well, no, I'm a purist. I've never been a standpoint epistemologist, as you know, and sort of infamous for writing a piece about Dorothy Smith along this line, that she wrote this huge answer to because she was so mad at us deconstructors. I mean, I don't think she even knew who I was, but she was so angry she just went on and felt, sort of pummeled by the time it was finished, Of course, my position would have to be, we'll play devil's advocate for a minute, because I appreciate what you asked. And as a feminist or as a Marxist, all of which I sometimes like to be and move into, that's why I said thought is tensed at the moment between these two positions. And so is my work. And even Derrida is sometimes, when not wanting to be connected with Fujiyama, thank you, with the end of history or meaninglessness, and he doesn't want to be, and he hasn't been writing that kind of stuff, so then he withdrew. But I think if you were to be correct, I think standpoint epistemology is a terrible mistake for the moment with regard to knowledge. It's not fast enough. It's not fast enough. It's an old line that still comes from science, that we could even be more objective by being able now to say not only what that is, but where I stand when I know that. I mean, it goes against not knowing. See, deconstruction's always about, like it or not, the idea not of multiplying ways of knowing or suggesting that there, and this is me, many perspectives, but in the end they come together. What's his term? The multiple, but they all come together eventually. And shoulds, all the significances have some kind of, and that's what standpoints are always about in the end. Some standpoints are theoretically, Dorothy Smith's standpoint is, Marx is one, Marx's cheap version of one, that the working class will know the truth because they're the first class that will understand that to do anything they would reset the oppressions. I don't understand human beings that way. I don't. I think I do simple, if you've been squished a lot, why would you know the truth? I think you might be, sort of angry, envious, crazed, militant. I mean, why the truth there? So standpoint epistemology is still connected to being able to know truly by being able to know where you stand. And I think we are actually in a knowledge situation, and I'm talking technology again, that's too fast for that. We have to talking critically about movement and speed rather than